the world we're operating now, it's not as patient. Customers don't wait. Channels don't behave predictably. AI-driven systems don't operate on publishing calendars.
DAM 4.0 is what happens when the system stops waiting for the humans to ask those right questions and starts responding on its own.
Welcome to Real Story on MarTech, ruthless advocates for your MarTech mission, advising buyers with just the facts on stacks to get you on the right track.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Real Story on MarTech. I'm Jarrod Gingras, Managing Director of Real Story Group.
I'm Tony Byrne, founder of Real Story Group.
All right, Tony. Today we're once again talking about my favorite topic, and that's DAM, Digital Asset Management. But today we're tackling this in a way that we're tackling something, I guess, that we've been dancing around for or circling around for years now. But because of AI and the impact that that's having on all of us, we're going to talk about something that feels more and more unavoidable, and that's the future direction of digital asset management as a whole, where all this is heading, and in particular, how this future relates to something we're calling your content demand chain. And to be clear here, Tony, I don't want this to be thought of as we're just going to list a bunch of features of what's coming next. The vendors all have their roadmaps. They'll all tell you their features that's coming next. But we want to talk about this in the context of what it means from a structural, architectural, and maybe most importantly, an enterprise foundational sense.
Yeah, that's so important, but also I think a MarTech leadership sense. Our audience here for this podcast are MarTech leaders, and there's a lot here for them to pay attention to.
Yeah, and speaking of those leaders, we've heard several, if not many of them, say, asset management and largely content management, that's the easy part, until they realize that it's the content oftentimes that's the bottleneck for everything else they want to do. These big personalization efforts or omni-channel efforts or real-time experiences that they want to provide or next best experiences, next best actions. And now, of course, all these seemingly endless possibilities that relate to AI, it comes back to content. So we see a bunch of these enterprises they're investing heavily in AI and decisioning and analytics and orchestration layers, but they're realizing, some faster than others, that the content underneath can't always keep up, or in most cases it's not ready for prime time, especially when we're talking about doing this at a scale. So this concept of DAM as a foundation, it's not flashy. It's not particularly exciting in demos, but it's absolutely critical for getting any of these higher level initiatives to actually work.
That's right. And as the Real Story Group, though, let's begin with a bit of a reality check here. Some of what we're going to be discussing today is future oriented and therefore, somewhat speculative. But much of what we're discussing is also based on what we're seeing among global 1,000 enterprises as we work with them to try to figure this out right now. To be sure, no one has completely figured this out, but we think the smart enterprises are those that are positioning DAM really as the backbone of content intelligence and responsiveness. Now, our regular listeners will remember that we discussed the 4-point DAM framework back in episode 6, which was a roadmap for your DAM journey. But in this episode, we're going to revisit DAM 3.0 and DAM 4.0 specifically. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to describe DAM 3.0 as a content warehouse and DAM 4.0 as something even more ambitious, what we call an intelligent responder. So these obviously are big ideas and require major shifts, but we think that they're really critical ideas for you, the MarTech leader, to consider. And they're going to, as you mentioned, they're going to be essential for this AI world.
Yeah. So as you said, Tony, we're going to talk a lot today about the future, the 3.0 and 4.0 stages in particular. But let's remind everyone about the 4.0 framework in general. So this is a model that we created several years ago, simply to assess where our clients were on their DAM journey, and maybe more importantly, where do they want to go? Yeah.
So that's a great story about the why we did this. I want to just quickly talk about the what, because I think it's especially important, is that the DAM 4.0 framework, it's not really a maturity model. You don't wake up one day and say, we made all these incremental changes, now we're in DAM 2.0. It's not evolutionary, like going, from Homo habilis to Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, It's much more, than a maturity model. For sure, it does talk about some operational evolution, and that's important, but it's really a business value model. And in 4.0, I would argue it's a customer value model. And each one of these changes from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, so on, they're major step changes, organizationally, but also from a business value perspective, and very often it's a technical change as well. So you have to be deliberate about it, and that in turn, requires leadership. So anyway, with that little background here, why don't you take us into for some people reality, some people history. Let's talk a little bit more about level 1.0 and 2.0 of the DAM framework.
Yeah, so let's start at the beginning. 1.0 is something that we call DAM as a standalone library. So it's a centralized place to put all of your assets and manage them through a life cycle. It's way better than having your assets scattered across your organization in, a multitude of repositories like drives and shared drives and cloud drives and whatnot. But in a 1.0 organization, that system that's managing those assets is disconnected from your larger technology ecosystem. So some of you do this without even a formal DAM, right? It's still just a single place to go to kind of find and retrieve and place and store assets. 2.0 is a bit of a shift, a pretty big shift, and that's DAM as a connective service. Here's where you need true DAM software, that it's recognized as part of MarTech. It's part of a flow from upstream systems like Creative Suite tools to downstream systems of engagement like web content management or social publishing tools or email tools, marketing automation tools, etc. And Tony, just be honest here. Most of the enterprises that we work with are fundamentally 2.0 organizations. They've matured beyond that standalone library, and they have started to connect this in this DAM system as part of MarTech. And I'll say some of the larger companies that we work with are with something that we even describe as high-functioning 2.0 organizations, like on the cusp to do something greater, but that's really where they sit today.
Yeah, on the cusp is interesting because, again, it's a very deliberate step change, in many cases a very major step change. And one of the things that keeps coming up in our conversations with enterprise, again, is its assumption that this, DAM progression is, somehow incremental and linear, and this natural evolution is going to happen. And so we'll sometimes hear, well, we did DAM 1.0 and then we integrated some stuff downstream. Seems to be working. So now we're basically at DAM 3.0. And that assumption is almost always wrong. Going from 2 to 3 is a really big step change, even if getting to 2 might have been hard in the first place.
Yeah. And I think part of that problem is that DAM 2.0 for many organizations, it feels sophisticated. You've got those integrations into your creative tools, your CMS, your PIM, your marketing automation, maybe even your e-commerce tools. It feels like you've crossed some sort of threshold there. And to be fair, you have, but it's still fundamentally about this one-way flow of assets, and we're really missing some level of intelligence as it relates to your content that I think many organizations that we work with are demanding, as we transition to this AI world.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, when you talk about intelligence, then you have to introduce this huge topic of AI. And of course, it's critical because, this is where the desire to get beyond the 2.0 world is coming from. And it's also where, frankly, a lot of wishful thinking shows up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's this idea floating around. I hear it time and time again from vendors. I hear it time and again from other consultants in this industry. I certainly hear it from some of the buyers that we work with. And this idea that you could just sprinkle some AI on your content or sprinkle some AI on your existing DAM, and suddenly everything's going to become intelligent and the system's going to figure everything out. That's not exactly how this is all going to work, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of concepts here. One is that a lot of the AI we see out here are kind of tactical improvements to your content supply chain, and of course that's welcome. But it's not necessarily a fundamental shift. It's maybe some better productivity, some faster cycles, all good, all internally, not necessarily driving a lot of value. But I think, Jarrod, there's a deeper structural kind of issue here around where the value from AI really is going to come from. And the thing about AI systems and algorithms is that they best understand structure, patterns, and relationships. So if your content isn't modeled in a way that machines can reason about, AI can't really do much beyond some simple tagging and summarization.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're seeing a major stumbling point for the legacy vendors, if you will, out there in the DAM marketplace. These traditional architectures just hit a ceiling, right? They were built for humans to go into a system, do some kind of search or browse and find the asset they're looking for and download it. right? They're not built for these machines assembling experiences dynamically. And that's a huge difference in way of thinking, right? So this content warehouse topic that we're going to talk about is going to change that by providing structured, componentized inputs with clear metadata, with explicit lineage and usage rules.
Well, Jarrod, you packed a lot into that last sentence, so let's make it a little bit more concrete. And let's start out with, DAM 3.0, a content warehouse. At a high level, what are some of the things that you would typically expect it to be able to offer? Then we'll dig into some details. So at a high level, first, we're looking at component level management, where content is broken down into reusable parts, not locked inside of finished assets. And again, these parts can be textual, they can be image and media assets, they can be data that presents or shows up as content in the experience layer. So that's first, this is component level management. Second is compound and mixed media assembly. So campaigns or messages are assembled dynamically from components rather than recreated from scratch. So you could think of an email block as this kind of compound asset, because the email block is likely to have an image, some text, a label, a title, somewhere in there, a hyperlink, some reporting code, that kind of thing. That's kind of a sense, it's made up of assets, but it's also a compound asset in and of itself. And then third is this critical two-way information flow. So this is really a big kind of innovation in content in DAM 3.0. And we're already seeing some interesting results here, as you know. And the point here is that content just doesn't flow out to channels. Data flows back in. Usage analytics, engagement metrics, even AI-generated variants and derivatives, they feed back into the system.
Yeah, that two-way conversation is a major feature of this 3.0 world. But Tony, let's dig into the content warehouse even deeper, right? Because I think this is for some people a very different concept than they're used to, right? This is something that's really difficult to understanding. So let's talk about, what are we describing when we say content warehouse?
Yeah, and it's also easy to misunderstand. A content warehouse is not a dam with a bunch more stuff shoved into it. And it's not just we added structured content, and it's definitely not, we renamed our dam, and it's definitely not we took all of the whole universe of raw content and shoved it into a single place. That would be more like a content lake, and that's not what we're talking about here as a content lake. We're talking about a content warehouse. And at its core, the content warehouse is about how your most important customer-facing content is modeled and related, not just where it's stored. Storage is a little bit of a separate issue. We'll come back to it later.
Exactly. In a DAM 3.0 content warehouse, I think you mentioned this, media, narrative, and data, they're all first-class citizens in this world, right? They're not subordinate to each other. They're peers. They're connected through, maybe even most importantly, some real explicit relationships that you're managing within this warehouse.
Yeah, and this is why your traditional PIM or your traditional CMS isn't going to cut it in this world, especially your web content management system, and that includes headless CMSs. They don't treat all of these three critical pieces of information as first-class citizens, and they're really more, to that extent, they're really more silos in not just functionally, but also in terms of the types of content they support. But the other thing, and this is maybe the most important thing, is that this is where a graph model comes in.
All right, Tony, let's explain what you mean by the graph model here, because this is really a critical concept for, that explains what we mean by when we're talking about what distinguishes a 2.0 system from a true 3.0 content warehouse type environment.
Yeah, so there's, graph isn't necessarily new, but it is, I think, increasingly important and in some ways maybe essential concept in this conversation. So let's back up for a second and say, historically in the digital world, there have been a couple different ways of modeling information. So you have a traditional database, which is typically relational, organizes information into tables and rows and columns, and it relies on joins to reconstruct relationships between entities like assets, campaigns, locales, rights, that sort of thing. This works pretty well, very well for stable transactional data, predefined reporting. it becomes increasingly complex and inefficient as content relationships multiply and evolve. And of course, as relationships multiply and evolve, that's more value that you really want to leverage with AI. The same thing goes for hierarchical databases and hierarchical models like XML. So XML is great for certain types of encapsulation and for like parent, child, sibling stuff, which is, to be sure, very important requirement in a 3.0 world to have this notion of parents and child and siblings. But it doesn't account for all the different relationships that you need, and again, that AI really needs. So what a graph repository takes is a fundamentally different approach by treating both content and its relationships as first-class objects. So it's storing assets, variants, usage rules, performance signals, derivatives, and the lineage all as a connected network, rather than as a hierarchy or relational table.
Right. So instead of the traditional model of folders and paths, you have nodes and relationships that you're managing. Let's take an example of like a hero image. It's not that hero image doesn't just live in one place in a folder. That hero image is related to campaigns, regions, audiences, maybe usage rights, derivatives, and ultimately their performance outcomes.
Right, and once you see content that way, a lot of things change, a lot of benefits come down the pike here. So reuse can become much more intentional instead of accidental or incidental. And let's talk a little bit about reuse here, because we've been hinting about this notion of variants and derivatives. So variants you might think of as siblings. So you might have 10 different versions of a particular hero image for 10 different customer segments. So variants are very important, for example, for personalization. And then there's derivatives, which is taking an asset or a compound asset and making essentially a child version of it. So you might have a video that you have 5 different versions of for different contexts. So that would be like a derivative, right? And so these are very difficult things for people to manage today, and they're impossible to manage in the future for reasons we're going to describe, to do it in today's sort of manual way. So what this graph model gives us is a better way for variants to become manageable instead of chaotic, and for derivatives to become visible instead of hidden away downstream. And then this gives you opportunities to handle things like inheritance and governance and compliance, in a much more automated way rather than, enforcing them manually.
Yeah, I think you've described exactly why this is such a big leap, right? When we are talking about technology, but it's not just about replatforming technology, right? You're fundamentally rethinking how your content exists and is managed within your enterprise as a whole. It's a huge shift.
That's right. And so you hinted at the beginning about what's really driving this shift is this, the supply chain still exists and can be better, but it's this notion of really a demand chain that we need to focus on here. And I want to slow down on this point because I think it's one of the most important mental shifts, certainly in the entire 3.0 to 4.0 conversation. Historically, DAM has lived almost entirely in what we call the content supply chain. And historically, it was at the end of the content supply chain. You had a finished asset. And that framing has shaped everything about how organizations design, buy, and operate DAM, and how organizations sort of, operate just more generally in terms of using content and injecting that content into experiences. Even the notion of a finished asset, I think, is no longer really applies in the era of AI, where you're going to demand all sorts of variants and child presentations. So this is a brand new world, baby.
Right. The supply chain mindset has become pervasive in the DAM world. I mean, it's something that when I go to conferences, everyone's talking about the content supply chain, and that's great. But the content supply chain is all about production and movement, right? It's like, how do we create content efficiently? How do we move it through some workflows? How do we distribute it out to the channels? And DAM fits very neatly into that story because it's a system right in the middle there that, if done right, reduces some of that friction and enforces control in that chain.
Yeah, and that mindset made total sense for a long time, and still does make sense. Enterprises are drowning in assets, creative cycles are slow, brand consistency is hard to enforce. So DAM can become a way to bring order to this chaos, centralize, standardize, govern, produce, push acceptable content downstream.
Yeah, but the key word there, Tony, that you said is push, right? It's the supply chain is fundamentally push oriented. Content is created based on some plans, assumptions, and forecasts, and then you package it all up and send it out into the world. And maybe, if you're lucky, you look at the performance data later, right? It's just one way.
Yeah, totally. And that's where the first cracks start to show, because in the world we're operating now, it's not as patient. Customers don't wait. Channels don't behave predictably. AI-driven systems don't operate on publishing calendars. They increasingly operate on intent, context, and demand signals. And so, this notion of a 6-week campaign cycle, that was already becoming untenable, especially when 10 different people are involved. And that world is changing and needs to change. The other big thing that's happening here that just doubles the dilemma really for the MarTech leader, and it's not happening so much now, but it's coming, and this is customer side agents, which some people call digital twins. So we're going to talk more about customer agents and certainly enterprise agents, which are going to be part of realizing this demand chain. But just if we speak about digital twins for a minute, this is going to double the complexity of content consumption and experience assembly. And I know we'll have more to say about that, but it's just compounds this whole insufficiency, I think, of even the best laid plans that we have around this wonderful supply chain leading into a content warehouse.
Yeah, and this is all related to why we're seeing this shift to what you described and what we're calling this content demand chain. It's a real difference here. So instead of starting with things like what content did we produce, the demand chain starts with what content is being requested, discovered, or needed right now.
Yeah, and it's a profound inversion at two levels. I mean, I think one, it's a profound inversion just conceptually that we've all been talking about, customer-centric stacks. And this is really going to call the question that your customers are going to show up in different forms, in different levels, in different contexts in a way that you cannot manually fulfill. And so we have to, rather than thinking kind of push forward, we have to call what, my mother had something of a potty mouth, and she called this, glass backwards. You start thinking glass backwards. So as a practical matter, when we start thinking about demand chain, Jarrod, content isn't just something you ship. It's something that's pulled based on context, a customer context, a device context, a regulatory context. And in the case of intermediaries and digital twins, increasingly it's going to be a machine context.
Oh, definitely increasingly machine. It's not just about humans anymore, right? It's increasingly we're seeing it's more about machines consuming content on behalf of humans, right? So the third-party machines like chatbots, recommendation engines, and then there's the customer's own intelligent agents. These systems don't browse libraries. They're looking for intent. They're querying intent.
Yeah, and they're asking questions like, what's the most relevant content for the situation? If your DAM can only answer, here are some assets in a folder, you're already behind. And this is critically important because these agents are going to be important filtering mechanisms, and you may or may not know when and where and why you were blocked and filtered out. So you have to really pay close attention here.
That's right. In the demand chain world, I think the DAM has to respond with content that's already structured, already governed, already adaptable, and ready to go. And it has to know which variants are valid and which aren't, and which combinations are allowed and which aren't, and which pieces are more likely to perform best in which contexts.
Yeah, and so that's where DAM 3.0 starts to feel a little bit insufficient on its own. Now, to be fair, you do need to go to Content 3.0, this content warehouse, because it gives you the structure, it gives you the intelligence at rest, it gives you the relationships. But the demand chain requires you to expose those relationships. It requires intelligence in motion.
Exactly. And because the demand chain is not linear, it's dynamic, it's not predictable. Requests are coming from everywhere at any time and often in forms you didn't explicitly design for.
Yeah, and this is also where measurement fundamentally changes. In the supply chain, measurement tends to be retrospective. Think about campaign reports or postmortems. And of course, everybody's frustrated because those often come too late to really, optimize in a time frame that would matter. But fundamentally, these are retrospective, right? They're dashboards that explain what happened last month, last quarter, last year.
That's funny. We always talk about dashboards, and when we select technology, it's always a scenario. It's like, show me your analytics, show me your dashboards. But whenever we push our clients, like, how often do you actually use those dashboards? And it's pretty rare, right? So the idea in this new world, in this demand chain world, measurement is continuous and operational. It's not an afterthought, right? Every interaction is actually feedback. Every request is a signal, and that signal needs to flow back into the system immediately, not 6 weeks later in some PowerPoint deck.
Yeah. And so, wow, this means a lot of things. So it means that if you think about DAM, or more broadly, you're addressing your content demand chain, you can't really be a passive participant anymore. You can't just store content and wait. You have to be listening here. And it has to observe how content is being used, which variants are selected, which ones are ignored, and how the performance shifts over time across all these different contexts. So it's definitely a hard problem.
Yeah, and this is where a lot of organizations that we work with, they're struggling because it's uncomfortable. The demand chain exposes a lot of reality within your organization, your content readiness, your governance readiness, and it shows that kind of the dirty little secret here is that your carefully crafted content that you spent so much money on doesn't always get used, or that the local teams are constantly working around the centralized assets that you're providing them because they don't fit their real world needs. These are uncomfortable conclusions that we're seeing our clients get to and say, this isn't working.
Yeah, or the agent ignores your response because it's not really structured enough or structured in the way that it needs to see it. But that discomfort is actually where the value lies. And at some level, the demand chain tells you the truth in a way I think that previous interactions and measuring those interactions haven't always told us what's the reality. And if your DAM is wired into that reality, you can supply some meaning and some value into the customer context. And that can start to guide better outcomes.
Yeah, and that's why I am a little bullish on this space here, because I think there's a big promise here is that DAM stops just being this execution tool in the chain and starts becoming a learning tool and part of the environment.
Yeah. And once that happens, DAM writ large is no longer a back office system. It's part of the real-time experience layer. It's answering questions, it's shaping responses for humans and bots alike. It's influencing what actually shows up in front of customers and machines, right? Now, there is a broader kind of physical architecture question here that we're not going to get into too much today, but I think it's worth pointing out, is whether your DAM itself is the runtime system. That's another question. And there's going to be intermediary layers. You're going to need insights from AI. You're going to need decisioning and other things to help assemble that whole experience. But the larger point is that you need to address a content demand chain. And for many of you, that's going to prove to actually be more important than automating your supply chain, and certainly much more amenable to AI-based automation that drives value. In fact, I would say that unlike the supply chain, I think AI is going to be essential to an effective content demand chain, because you simply can't address all the different permutations manually.
All right, Tony. So let's shift gears slightly here. Let's talk a little bit more about the 4.0 world that we're describing, this intelligent DAM as the intelligent responder. So if DAM 3.0 is all about building intelligence into the system through what we described as structure, relationships, metadata, analytics, then 4.0 is about activating that intelligence. And this is where, as you already alluded to, this is where intelligence moves from that rest state to a state of motion.
That's right. And that distinction matters because a lot of organizations think that once they built a content warehouse, they've done the hard part. And it was hard. But in reality, they've just created the conditions for supplying this meaning through content in an intelligent way. Haven't yet deployed that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, DAM 4.0 is what happens when the system stops waiting for the humans to ask those right questions and starts responding on its own, right? That's why we're using this term intelligent responder. It's not just smart, it's actually active.
Yeah, and when we say responding, let's be clear, we don't just mean returning search results faster, although clearly having a content warehouse and having it structured will definitely help you, with AEO or GEO, generative experience optimization, AI experience optimization. We're already seeing that, right? But we're talking about something way beyond that. We mean sensing context, right? So context could be someone's channel. understanding and maybe even predicting needs, and then taking action, often in real time. So again, there's a lot of different types of AI that are showing up there. You need insights AI, you definitely need decisioning AI, but first and foremost, you need the right content assets available in the right format and the right level of detail to be able to respond in real time.
Yeah, think about the kind of questions that a system like this needs to answer in this world, right? Not where is the asset, but which content is appropriate for now, for this audience, on this device, given a whole bunch of requirements like brand constraints, legal constraints, performance constraints. That's super powerful.
Yeah, and again, these are multidimensional questions that are going to require multidimensional capabilities on the enterprise side, even beyond, DAM and content management. But at a base level, they require a system to reason across structured data, unstructured content, usage history, governance rules. And in most cases, they're going to have to deliver these answers in milliseconds, not minutes or hours or even days.
Yeah, and I think where we're headed in a 4.0 world is the system that we're talking about. The 4.0 world is not just going to answer those questions, actually going to act on them. It's going to select content for you. It's going to assemble variants for you. It's going to adapt experiences for you. And it's going to do so, if done right, consistently without waiting for some manual intervention.
Yeah, and this is where people get nervous because autonomy implies a loss of control. And, we can talk more here as we have in the past about AI and people being before the loop, in the loop, on the loop, after the loop, all of that. So it's not like people go away. It's just that the roles are going to change. But, I understand the fear because there's fear of change, but even more the bigger fear, and even underneath that, is that this autonomy implies a kind of a loss of control.
Yeah, it does, but that's I think in the vision that we're describing, governance becomes even more important, not less, right? So an intelligent responder does not replace governance; it actually operationalizes it, because you're doing these things at a scale that you couldn't do with human intervention, right? So the rules are actually encoded into the system, so the responses it's giving you are compliant, on brand, and explainable without that human in the loop.
Yeah, and explainability is the key here. And unfortunately, you don't always get that in the AI platforms that are on offer circa 2026. But for sure, enterprises don't just need systems that act, they need systems that can justify why they acted in a certain way. And of course, this is especially important in regulated industries. Certainly our pharma and financial services, life sciences, insurance clients, they know that system needs to show lineage and decision paths, what data informed the response, what rules were applied, what content was generated. And so, this new world can't be a black box. The other important distinction is that DAM 4.0 isn't, just about generating more content. I know this is like the third time I've said that, but I really want to emphasize it's living in kind of a broader ecosystem here, and there's certainly a lot of hype around generative AI, and it is useful, particularly for generating variants and derivatives, which are so critical. But generation alone, Jarrod, it isn't intelligence.
Right. Generation alone is easy, right? And that's why we're seeing so many of these like really slick demos and pilots that are cropping up, and it's easy to generate new content, but evaluating it, refining it, and retiring it in often cases is based on, and doing that in an environment that's based on real success and real performance. That's the hard part, and I think that's what we're describing in this utopian 4.0 world. Is and where 4.0 really differentiates itself from what we're doing today.
Right. So an intelligent responder, it doesn't just create variants, which is kind of where we're all thinking about right now. It tests them, it measures outcomes, it learns from which combinations work and which don't, and then it feeds that learning back into future responses, all with some degree of governance, guardrails, and certainly human oversight.
Right. So if you do this right, the system's going to improve over time. It's not just going to react to someone's requirements that they manually updated in a playbook of some sort. It's gonna improve because the system observed reality, what worked, what didn't, and it adjusted.
Yeah, and here again, this is yet another example of the huge shift from how we've historically used and conceived DAM. Traditionally DAM is been static. Content goes in, content goes out, learning happens elsewhere, if it happens at all. DAM 4.0 really kind of, I would say, collapses that distance, at least to some extent. Learning happens inside the system. Every interaction becomes a data point, and every deployment becomes an experiment. And at least in theory, we'll talk about it later how in practice how this may be difficult, but let's talk about it at least conceptually here, is that this is where DAM, at least DAM writ large, becomes inseparable from real-time experience delivery. It's no longer, just sitting behind the scenes. It's part of the execution path, and there are going to be assets, or certainly variants of assets, that are going to get generated in real time, not necessarily pre-generated. The future is going to be a mix of that. Sure, you'll have a number of things pre-generated, if only for performance reasons, but you're also going to see assets generated in or at least derivative assets or variant assets generated in real time as part of the execution path. And we're all going to have to figure out a way to get comfortable with that, because in the future of the demand chain, we kind of have no choice.
Yes, I totally agree, but I want to be really clear here about what DAM 4.0 is not, because we've described this utopian universe, like I said, and I want to be clear though, it's not a replacement for things like customer data platforms. It's not a replacement for your decision engines or your personalization systems.
That's right, and those systems still matter. They're going to be evolving too, and so. We're going to have the other two pillars of the three-pillar MarTech stack, which is data and decisioning. They're going to have to evolve to 4.0 as well. But even if they do, and at some level, certainly on the data side, I think we're ahead of the content side. But what we're also learning is that without the right content, structured, governed, and adaptable, the best data strategy in the world still isn't going to deliver meaningful experiences to the customer. So, DAM 4.0 provides the content intelligence layer that these systems really depend on. And it ensures that when all that snazzy machine learning-based decisioning gets executed, there's actually content that's capable, Jarrod, of fulfilling it, right?
Yeah, and this all gets really interesting when you start to think about this fundamental change. Also changes who's actually caring about DAM or content or enterprise content across the board. Suddenly, it's not just the creatives and librarians, in that chain that we described. DAM is now playing this foundational role in your technology stack. So now your product leaders are paying attention, your CX leaders are paying attention, your AI teams are paying attention. Your legal team and your compliance team are certainly paying attention. Well, at least they should be, and because they all have a stake now.
Yeah, and that's both the opportunity and the challenge. But let's take a moment for a word from our sponsor.
Did you know that 16 of the Fortune 20 enterprises have turned to Real Story Group over the years for MarTech advice, either to guide them through an important technology selection or to help them steer their stack in the right direction?
That's right, Jarrod. But our Real Story Group corporate members come in many sizes, including some really digitally focused mid-sized firms. The key thing that all these clients share is a desire to take their MarTech stack to the next level and a desire to take their professional careers to the next level. So if you want to explore that further, find us at realstorygroup.com.
Okay, Tony, let's get a little bit more practical here in this next segment. Let's make this concrete, because whenever we talked about 4.0 and intelligent responders, there's a risk that what we're talking about sounds super futuristic, super theoretical. And in practice, this is actually already starting to show up, but maybe just in an uneven way, or in very narrow slices, or in the context of those pilots and experiments that we're talking about. I don't think enterprises can just flip a switch and become 4.0 overnight, even though some claim to be that claims to be their strategy. We hear some organizations like, we got to get to 4.0. We got to get there overnight. So we're seeing pockets of intelligent response, maybe a specific channel or a specific region, specific pilot, specific use case, but it's really where the cost of the manual effort has finally become intolerable. So you're finding these real little point solutions, but it's not necessarily foundational.
Yeah, and it's going to become increasingly intolerable going forward in the era of AI. And I think a good example is real-time digital experiences. So, you have websites, web apps, mobile apps, email personalization. the expectation is no longer, serve up the campaign we planned last quarter. It's like, serve up what makes sense right now. And oh, by the way, let's make sure it's coherent and consistent across all these different customer touch points.
Yeah, that requires a system to do a few things simultaneously, right? It has to understand the context, like device, geography, intent, timing. And then secondly, it has to know what content's available and which content is allowed for that context. And then it has to assemble and deliver it instantly. Simple.
Yeah, and well, for starters, hopefully, we'll talk about getting there. But if we look at this kind of retrospectively, for sure, Jarrod, this is where traditional DAM models fall apart, right? If the system can't tell the difference between a global master asset or a regionally approved variant, or a variant for SMS, versus WhatsApp, then, or if it can't adapt those formats on the fly, you're just forced back into a lot of manual workarounds. And a lot of it is doing this intense amount of pre-publishing for all of these different channels, all these different contexts, all these different variants. I think we all sense that this is becoming impossible, and this becomes then the uncomfortable sort of conversation. How do we get out of this? And many organizations aren't really ready to get there. And it's not because they don't understand the vision. They know that their current model is kind of bursting at the seams. There's really more going on here.
Yeah. And again, going back to that, what we keep seeing from many leaders that we talk to, I want to get to 4.0, I want to get to 4.0 tomorrow, right? But the hardest work is happening before that intelligence shows up. DAM 3.0, which is what we described as that critical step in this process, you can't skip it. It's expensive. And it's not just expensive in license fees, but you got to get your information architecture right, your taxonomies, or your increasingly more and more your ontologies right. You got to get your governance models right. You got to get your org structures right to support this type of change, or at least close enough. I say right, but you got to get it close enough. And we're going to dig deeper into a lot of these issues in some upcoming episodes, and including some very early ones in 2026, where we talk about the impact taxonomies and ontologies are having on this conversation. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and so let's just conclude with the last segment here, where, of course, the Real Story Group, we have to inject a little bit of a reality check. And I think there's really two reality checks here. One is, we've been talking as if all these future platforms are actually going to work, that the vendors aren't going to screw it up, that they're going to charge you appropriately, that what they say they can do, they can actually do, that there will be standards and integration. I mean, there's going to be, we talked a kind of utopian world where in reality there's going to be a lot of friction. And that's where the MarTech work is going to be in the future as it is today, which is trying to resolve all that friction. But it's still critical to have this vision of addressing the demand chain. And I think the other thing that's an important reality check here is on the technology side. And we haven't talked much about the technology, but all of this is really a fundamental shift in customer-focused content management in the context of DAM technology. But really, this could be a technology story that's even bigger than DAM, right?
Absolutely. It pains me to say it, but as enterprises move towards DAM 3.0 and they start to think about what it takes to build these content warehouses, it's become clear to me as I look at follow the DAM marketplace very closely that it's not just DAM platforms that are competing for this role. It's headless CMS vendors. It's product information management systems. It's customer data platforms, marketing clouds, even data platforms. Tony, you and I have seen some messaging out of Snowflake that say they're starting to position themselves as a potentially a system of truth for not just data but for content. And I think as we observe all these different marketplaces, kind of marching on the throne, to use my Game of Thrones analogy, who wants to be your content warehouse? Each of these technologies manages some combination of what we talked about: media, narrative, data, and each can make a plausible cause that it already sits closest to where the content is created, assembled, or activated. But maybe good news or maybe bad news as we try to figure this out, if you're on the buyer side, is that you don't have a lack of options. There's actually a crowded landscapes of overlapping claims with multiple vendors asserting that they should be your content warehouse. They should become the gravitational center of your enterprise so that you're stuck with them for years and years and years and years.
Yeah, so here's where we're going to bring in some of our technology expertise. And, And the challenge for you, the enterprise MarTech leader, is that none of these systems that Jarrod mentioned on their own is going to naturally fulfill the full mandate of a content warehouse. So let's be clear about that. In theory, you have a lot of choices. In practice, the choice set is pretty narrow. Let's start with these data lakehouses that you mentioned, Jarrod. Data warehouses and data lakehouses are very good at being system of truth. They deal very well with facts. In the content world, we're really talking more about meaning. And so, yes, I want a system of truth, but I also want a system of meaning. And traditional data warehouses, although you can jam unstructured and structured content into them, generally don't fulfill this role very well. And in particular, they don't often support graph models very well. So that's one that, we may see some action there. Is probably going to be more through acquisition than someone like a Snowflake actually building something themselves. The category of vendors who say that they can do this, a big one we mentioned earlier is CMS platforms. And some of them are beginning to do much better at structured content as well, but they struggle with media and the kind of lifecycle governance and the graph models, the relationships. It's just not there. And fundamentally, I think that they don't understand it. So it's really about going, if you say that your CMS is also your content warehouse, it's kind of going back to shoving all that content into a channel rather than having it be foundational. So that's bad. PIM systems are strong at product data, and so I get that, particularly for D2C companies, but they're weak at storytelling and experience context. And likewise, marketing clouds have kind of the opposite problem. They focus on activation and optimization, but they rarely manage content lineage or long-term reuse or just content in general. So that, leaves us with DAM systems. So DAM systems, this better than anyone in the world, Jarrod, bring deep media management and governance strengths. But they've historically lacked kind of robust narrative modeling and a kind of a demand side story. We're still, I think, likely to see the content warehouses come out of the DAM marketplace. It's just going to be a very discriminating small number of vendors that can do that. And at Real Story Group, we spend a lot of time helping clients kind of think through that and discern it. But anyway, I think the larger story here is maybe less about which vendor sort of wins the content warehouse role and more about, the architecture that can harmonize all of this. So whether your content warehouse is a physical entity or a logical entity, that kind of remains to be seen. We tend to think the physical option is a little bit better, even if your choices are narrower for a lot of reasons. Your incumbent vendors are going to want to talk to you about a logical content warehouse, and you'll need to just make sure that you're not strapping into, papering over a very old architecture there. So anyway, that was a long rant, but, we're Real Story Group. We believe the technology choices are important. Happy to talk to you more about that in more detail later.
Great. So in summary, I think we're all on the same page here. We believe that the future of DAM isn't optional. It's actually inevitable. It's changing. The demands that AI is putting on all of us, it's making us rethink the way we manage content, the way we think about content, the way we deliver content. But in order to get there, I think we're going to have to see some major shifts, both in our own internal enterprise thinking, as well as major shifts from the technology vendors. No one's cracked this completely, both from the buyer side or the sell side. And I can promise you one thing, at Real Story Group, we'll continue to monitor closely both the buyer's ambitions and the technology's capabilities to help our clients make the best possible decisions for today and what's to come tomorrow. So Tony, we'll have a lot more to say about DAM, a lot more to say about AI and where it's at and where it's going in the near future, but this is probably a good place to land for now. And as always, I just want to thank all of you for sticking with us and listening today. And if you like what you heard, we always ask that you please subscribe, like, share this with your friends, and tell us what you think. Where are you on your DAM journey? We always like to understand where people are at today in a real world situation, and where do you want to go, and how are you going to get there? And don't hesitate to reach out at any time. But thank you all so much for spending some time with us. So we'll see you next time on The Real Story on MarTech.